Marcus Williams had been angry at the world for as long as he could remember. At 19 years old, he carried himself with the swagger of someone who believed that showing weakness was the same as inviting attack. Growing up in one of London's toughest neighborhoods had taught him that respect came through fear, and fear came through violence. His knuckles bore the scars of countless street fights, and his reputation in South London was built on his willingness to use his fists first and ask questions later. On this cold February morning, Marcus found himself walking through Central London after another explosive argument with his girlfriend, Sarah. She had been begging him to find a job, to stop hanging around with his crew of troublemakers, to do something positive with his life. But Marcus saw her concerns as nagging, her suggestions as attempts to control him. The fight had ended with him storming out of their cramped flat, leaving Sarah in tears in their relationship. Hanging by a thread, Marcus's anger simmered as he walked aimlessly through the streets, looking for something or someone to take his frustration out on. His pockets contained the last of his unemployment benefits, barely enough for a cheap meal, and the weight of his failures pressed down on him like a physical burden. He had dropped out of school at 16, had been fired from every job he had managed to get, and had alienated most of his family with his aggressive behavior and poor choices. The morning crowds of commuters and tourists irritated Marcus further, as he pushed through them with unnecessary roughness. Business people in expensive suits hurried past him without making eye contact, treating him like he was invisible. Tourists with their cameras and guidebooks laughed and chatted as if they didn't have a care in the world. Everyone seemed to have purpose and direction except Marcus, who felt lost and increasingly angry about his own lack of prospects. As Marcus wandered through Westminster, found himself approaching the area around Buckingham Palace. The sight of the ornate buildings and well-dressed tourists only increased his resentment toward a world that seemed to offer opportunities to everyone except him. The contrast between the wealth and ceremony surrounding him and his own desperate circumstances felt like a personal insult. Standing at his post near the palace entrance was guard William Hayes, 26-year-old soldier who had been serving in the ceremonial unit for 3 years. William came from a working-class family in Manchester and had joined the army at 18 as a way to escape his own difficult circumstances. Through discipline, hard work, and dedication, he had earned his position among the elite soldiers. Chosen for Royal Guard duty, William's morning had begun like every other. With precise preparation of his uniform, careful attention to every detail of his appearance, and mental preparation for hours of maintaining perfect composure regardless of what happened around him. He understood that his role required him to remain motionless and silent even when faced with rudeness, mockery, or attempts to make him break character. Marcus noticed William immediately, drawn by the guard's perfect uniform and stoic expression. Something about William's obvious discipline and professionalism triggered Marcus's worst instincts. Here was someone who represented everything Marcus felt he could never achieve: success, respect, purpose, and self-control. The sight of William standing so perfectly at attention made Marcus feel even more aware of his own failures and lack of direction. A small crowd of tourists had gathered around William, taking photographs and making the usual attempts to get a reaction from the famously immovable guard. Marcus watched from a distance as children waved at William. Adults told jokes in his presence, and teenagers posed for selfies beside him. Through it all, William remained completely still, his eyes focused straight ahead, his breathing controlled and steady. Marcus felt his anger building as he observed the scene. The tourists treated William with a mixture of curiosity and respect that Marcus had never experienced in his own life. People smiled at William, spoke about him admiringly, and seemed genuinely impressed by his discipline and bearing. Had spent his entire life demanding respect through intimidation. But here was someone who commanded respect simply by doing his job with dignity. The contrast between William's composed professionalism and Marcus's own chaotic life became increasingly difficult for the young man to bear. Marcus saw in William everything he wasn't: disciplined, respected, successful, and apparently content with his place in the world. The guard's obvious self-control and purpose highlighted Marcus's own lack of both qualities in ways that made his existing anger burn even hotter. As Marcus continued to watch, his resentment focused more and more on William personally. The guard became a symbol of everything Marcus felt had been denied to him, every opportunity he had missed or thrown away. Every person who had achieved what Marcus believed he deserved but had never earned. The longer Marcus stared at William's perfect posture and serene expression, the more he wanted to destroy that composure and bring the guard down to his own level of frustration and chaos. Marcus began moving closer to William's position, his hands clenching into fists as his anger reached a boiling point. He had no clear plan, only a burning need to lash out at someone who represented everything he hated about his own failures. The tourists around William continued their harmless attempts to get a reaction, unaware that someone with much darker intentions was approaching the scene. William, for his part, remained focused on his duties, maintaining the professional bearing that his training demanded. He was unaware that Marcus was approaching, and even if he had noticed, his protocols required him to remain at his post and maintain his composure, regardless of potential threats or disturbances. William had no way of knowing that the next few minutes would test his discipline in ways his training had never anticipated. Marcus pushed through the crowd of tourists with growing aggression, his anger now focused entirely on the motionless guard, who seemed to embody everything Marcus felt he lacked in his own life. The morning shoppers and sightseers moved aside, as they sensed his hostile energy, though most assumed he was just another rude tourist rather than someone with genuinely dangerous intentions. As Marcus got closer to William, he could see the guard's face more clearly. William appeared to be about his own age, with the kind of clean-cut appearance that Marcus associated with people who had never struggled with real problems. The guard's uniform was immaculate, his posture perfect, and his expression serene, in a way that made Marcus's own inner turmoil feel even more unbearable by comparison. "Look at this pretty boy," Marcus muttered loud enough for nearby tourists to hear, standing there like he's better than everyone else, like he's some kind of hero or something. His voice carried the rough edge of someone looking for a fight, and several families with small children began to move away from the area, sensing that trouble might be brewing. William heard Marcus's comment, but maintained his professional composure, keeping his eyes focused straight ahead and his breathing steady. His training had prepared him for verbal provocations from tourists, drunks, and attention seekers, and he understood that responding to such behavior would only encourage more of it. William had dealt with countless attempts to make him break character, and he viewed Marcus's initial comments as just another test of his discipline. Marcus grew more frustrated as William continued to ignore him completely. The guard's lack of reaction felt like dismissal, another example of someone treating Marcus as if he were beneath notice. "I'm talking to you, soldier boy," Marcus said more loudly, stepping directly into William's line of sight. "Don't you have any manners? Didn't they teach you to answer when someone speaks to you?" The crowd around them began to take more notice of Marcus's aggressive behavior. Some tourists started recording with their phones, thinking they were about to witness another harmless attempt to make a guard break character. Others began backing away as they recognized that Marcus's hostility seemed more genuine and potentially dangerous than the usual tourist antics. Marcus interpreted William's continued silence as arrogance, another sign that the guard considered himself superior to someone like Marcus. The young man's anger, already burning hot from his fight with Sarah and his general frustration with his life, began to reach a dangerous level. He had spent 19 years learning that violence was often the fastest way to get attention, and respect and William's professional composure was triggering all of Marcus's worst impulses. "You think you're tough standing there in your fancy costume?" Marcus taunted, moving even closer to William. "You think that uniform makes you better than people like me? I bet you've never been in a real fight in your life." His voice was getting louder and more aggressive, drawing the attention of other guards and security personnel in the area. Though they were still too far away to intervene immediately, William remained motionless. Though Marcus's proximity and increasingly threatening tone were testing his training in ways he had never experienced before. The guard could sense that this wasn't a typical tourist encounter, but his protocols were clear: maintain position, maintain composure, and trust that backup would arrive if a genuine threat developed. William's years of training and natural discipline kept him focused on his duties, even as Marcus's anger escalated. Marcus was now standing directly in front of William, close enough to see the slight tension in the guard's jaw that indicated he was aware of the threat but determined not to react. That tiny sign of strain was exactly what Marcus had been looking for. Confirmation that his aggressive behavior was having an impact on the seemingly unflappable soldier. "There we go," Marcus said with a cruel smile. "I can see you're not as calm as you pretend to be. You're just another scared kid playing dress-up for the tourists." He began circling around William like a predator, looking for any other signs that his intimidation was working. The crowd of onlookers had grown larger, some people filming the confrontation, while others looked around nervously. For security personnel, Marcus's anger and frustration had been building for months, fueled by his unemployment, his failing relationship, and his general sense that life was unfair to him while rewarding others who didn't deserve it. William's perfect uniform and disciplined bearing represented everything Marcus felt had been denied to him, and the guard's refusal to acknowledge his presence felt like another rejection in a life full of disappointments. The breaking point came when Marcus noticed a young couple taking selfies nearby, smiling and laughing as they posed with William in the background. Their obvious happiness and carefree attitude reminded Marcus of everything he didn't have: a stable relationship, financial security, and the kind of joy that seemed to come naturally to people whose lives were working out according to plan. "Everyone's having such a good time with their perfect little soldier," Marcus said, his voice dripping with resentment. "Maybe it's time someone showed them what you're really made of." His hands clenched into fists as his anger reached a peak. That would lead to a decision that would change both their lives forever. William sensed the shift in Marcus's energy and prepared himself mentally for whatever was about to happen. His training had taught him to remain professional under all circumstances, but nothing had fully prepared him for someone whose anger was this personal and this intense. William knew that the next few seconds would test every aspect of his discipline and character in ways he had never imagined. Without warning, Marcus's hand shot out and struck William across the face with a sharp slap that echoed across the courtyard. The sound was loud enough to startle nearby tourists and cause gasps of shock from the crowd that had gathered to watch what they thought would be a harmless encounter. The force of the blow was significant, leaving a red mark on William's cheek and causing his head to snap slightly to one side. For a moment, time seemed frozen. The tourists stopped taking photos, conversations ceased, and even the background noise of London traffic seemed to fade as everyone waited to see how the guard would respond to such a blatant assault. Marcus stood with his hands still raised, breathing heavily from the adrenaline and anger that had driven him to strike a uniformed soldier in broad daylight. William's face stung from the impact, and his natural instincts screamed at him to retaliate against the unprovoked attack. Every muscle in his body tensed as his training and his human emotions warred with each other. The slap had been not just painful but deeply humiliating, delivered in front of dozens of witnesses who were now staring at him with a mixture of shock and expectation. But instead of striking back, instead of breaking his composure or abandoning his post, William did something that stunned everyone present, including Marcus himself. Slowly, with deliberate precision, William straightened his posture, adjusted his grip on his rifle, and returned his gaze to the exact position where it had been before the attack. His breathing remained controlled, his expression returned to its professional neutrality, and his stance resumed its perfect military bearing. Marcus stared at William in complete disbelief. He had expected anger, retaliation, or at least some kind of emotional response to justify his own aggressive behavior. Instead, the guard had absorbed the assault and simply returned to his duties as if nothing had happened. The complete lack of reaction left Marcus feeling confused and strangely deflated, as if his violence had been absorbed by something stronger than he understood. The crowd around them remained silent for several long seconds, processing what they had just witnessed. Many had their phones recording, capturing the moment when a young man's unprovoked violence had been met with extraordinary self-discipline and professionalism. The contrast between Marcus's explosive anger and William's controlled response was so stark that it seemed almost unreal. "What's wrong with you?" Marcus demanded, his voice now carrying a note of confusion alongside his anger. "I just hit you, and you're going to stand there and pretend nothing happened? Fight back, you coward. Show everyone what you're really made of." His words were meant to provoke William into breaking his composure, but they rang hollow in the face of the guard's unwavering discipline. William's lack of response was not weakness, or cowardice, as Marcus interpreted it, but rather the result of years of training designed to prepare guards for exactly this type of situation. William understood that his role required him to maintain composure regardless of personal provocation, and that responding to violence with violence would dishonor his uniform and his service. The red mark on William's cheek was clearly visible. To everyone present, physical evidence of the unprovoked assault he had endured. Yet his expression remained calm and focused, his posture perfect, and his dedication to his duties unshaken. The sight of his discipline in the face of such treatment began to affect the observers in ways that none of them had expected. A woman in the crowd stepped forward, her voice shaking with emotion as she addressed Marcus directly. "Young man, you should be ashamed of yourself," she said firmly. "That soldier is doing his job with honor and dignity, and you've behaved like a common thug. You owe him an apology." Her words carried the authority of someone who had lived long enough to recognize character when she saw it. Other voices in the crowd began to express similar sentiments. Tourists from various countries united in their disapproval of Marcus's behavior and their admiration for William's response. The international nature of the audience meant that William's discipline was being witnessed and appreciated by people from around the world, all of whom recognized something extraordinary in his reaction to the assault. Marcus found himself facing a wall of disapproval from strangers who had witnessed his unprovoked attack on a soldier who was simply doing his job. The validation he had expected from his violence had not materialized. Instead, he was being condemned by people who clearly saw William as the victim and Marcus as the aggressor. The realization that he had made himself look like the villain rather than the tough guy he wanted to be began to penetrate his anger. Security personnel were now approaching the scene. Having been alerted by the commotion and the crowd's reaction to what had occurred, Marcus could see uniformed officers making their way toward him. He realized that his moment of violence was likely to have legal consequences that he hadn't considered when his anger had driven him to strike the guard. But more disturbing to Marcus than the approaching security was the growing realization that William's response to being slapped had revealed something about strength and character that Marcus didn't understand. The guard's refusal to retaliate, his maintenance of discipline under assault, and his continued dedication to his duties despite being attacked were demonstrating a kind of power that Marcus had never encountered before. William continued to stand at perfect attention, fulfilling his duties with the same professionalism he had shown before the assault. The red mark on his cheek was fading, but the impact of his disciplined response was growing stronger with each passing moment. Marcus found himself staring at the guard with something approaching confusion, unable to understand how someone could be so completely unmoved by violence and provocation. As the security officers reached the scene, Marcus found himself surrounded by people whose disapproval was palpable. The crowd had grown to nearly 50 onlookers, many of whom had recorded the entire incident on their phones. What had started as Marcus's attempt to assert his dominance had transformed into a public demonstration of his own lack of self-control, contrasted sharply with William's extraordinary discipline. "Sir, you're under arrest for assault on a member of Her Majesty's forces," announced Sergeant Peters, a veteran police officer who had dealt with countless incidents around the royal palaces. His tone was professional, but firm as he approached Marcus with handcuffs ready. "You have the right to remain silent, but anything you do say may be given in evidence." Marcus felt panic beginning to replace his anger as the reality of his situation became clear. It struck a royal guard in front of dozens of witnesses, many of whom had recorded the assault. The legal consequences of his actions were suddenly very real, and his moment of violent impulse was likely to result in a criminal record that would make his already difficult life even more challenging. "Wait," Marcus said desperately, looking at around at the hostile faces surrounding him. It wasn't that serious. I barely touched him. Look, he's fine. He doesn't even care. His attempts to minimize his actions only made him look more desperate and less sympathetic to the observers who had witnessed the unprovoked attack. William remained at his post, maintaining his professional composure even as the arrest proceeded just a few feet away from him. His dedication to his duties in the face of assault and the surrounding commotion was remarkable to witness. And several tourists commented quietly about the extraordinary self-discipline they were observing. Sergeant Peters glanced at William with obvious respect before turning back to Marcus. That soldier's professionalism doesn't diminish the seriousness of your offense, son. You assaulted a member of the armed forces who was performing his duties. The fact that he maintained his composure speaks to his character, not to the acceptability of your behavior. As the handcuffs were placed on his wrists, Marcus looked back at William one more time. The guard's perfect posture and unwavering focus created a stark contrast with Marcus's own disheveled appearance and obvious distress. For the first time since the incident began, Marcus found himself wondering what kind of person could absorb such treatment and simply continue doing their job as if nothing had happened. The crowd began to disperse as Marcus was led away. Many people stayed to express their admiration for William's handling of the situation. An American tourist approached the area near William's post and spoke quietly, knowing the guard couldn't respond, but wanting to express his respect. "That was incredible, soldier. Thank you for showing us what real strength looks like." Similar comments came from other observers, creating an impromptu tribute to William's discipline and character. People from different countries and backgrounds found common ground in their appreciation for the guard's professional response to unprovoked violence. William could hear their words of support, and while he couldn't respond directly, the recognition of his service meant more to him than they could know. As Marcus was processed at the local police station, he had time to think about what had just occurred. The holding cell gave him his first quiet moment since the morning's argument with Sarah. And without distractions or an audience, he began to reflect on his behavior and its consequences. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving him to confront the reality of what he had done and why. Marcus realized that striking William had not made him feel stronger or more respected, as violence usually did in his neighborhood conflicts. Instead, the guard's disciplined response had made Marcus feel smaller and more out of control than ever. William's refusal to retaliate had somehow diminished Marcus rather than empowering him, leaving him feeling confused about everything he thought he knew about strength and respect. The police interview process forced Marcus to confront his actions. Directly, when asked why he had struck the guard, Marcus struggled to provide an explanation that made sense even to himself. "I was angry," he finally admitted. "He just stood there looking so perfect and disciplined, and I wanted to see if I could break that. I wanted to prove that he wasn't as strong as he looked." The interviewing officer, Detective Inspector Sarah Coleman, had seen many young men like Marcus during her 15 years on the force. She recognized the signs of someone whose life had spiraled out of control and who had lashed out at a convenient target rather than addressing his real problems. "And did you prove what you wanted to prove?" she asked gently. Marcus was quiet for a long moment before answering. "No," he said finally. "I think I proved the opposite. I think I proved that he's stronger than I am, and I don't even understand." "How?" The admission was painful but honest, representing the first time Marcus had acknowledged that his violence might not be a sign of strength. Back at the palace, William continued his duties for the remainder of his shift, though word of the incident had spread throughout the guard unit. His fellow soldiers expressed their support and admiration for how he had handled the assault, recognizing that maintaining composure under such circumstances required exceptional discipline and character. William's commanding officer, Major Harrison, spoke with him privately after his shift ended. "Guard Hayes, your conduct today was exemplary," the major said formally. "You maintained the highest standards of military bearing under circumstances that would have challenged any soldier. Professionalism reflects well on the entire unit." William appreciated the recognition, right? But he found himself thinking about Marcus and wondering what had driven the young man to such desperate behavior. The guard had seen genuine pain and confusion in Marcus's eyes during the arrest, and he couldn't help wondering if there might be more to the story than simple aggression and poor choices. Marcus spent 3 days in custody before being released on bail. 3 days that gave him more time to think than he had experienced in years. Without the constant distractions of his chaotic lifestyle, without his friends reinforcing his aggressive attitudes, and without the ability to lash out at others, Marcus was forced to confront the reality of who he had become and the path his life was taking. The videos of the incident had gone viral on social media, with millions of people around the world watching William's disciplined response to Marcus's unprovoked attack. The overwhelming reaction was admiration for the guard's professionalism and criticism of Marcus's behavior. Reading the comments was painful but educational for Marcus, as he saw himself described as a thug, a coward, and an embarrassment by people from every continent. What struck Marcus most powerfully about the online reaction was how consistently people praised William's strength while criticizing Marcus's weakness. This was the opposite of everything Marcus had learned about power and respect during his 19 years of life. In his neighborhood, the person who hit first and hit hardest usually won the respect of others. But William had gained worldwide admiration by refusing to hit back at all. Sarah visited Marcus at the police station, and their conversation was unlike any they had ever had. Instead of the shouting matches that usually characterized their relationship, Sarah spoke quietly and sadly about her disappointment in his behavior and her fear for his future. "Marcus," she said through tears, "I saw the video online." Everyone saw the video. How could you do that to someone who was just doing his job? Marcus found himself unable to provide Sarah with an explanation that satisfied either of them. His usual excuses about being disrespected or provoked rang hollow when applied to his attack on William, who had done nothing except stand at his post and perform his duties professionally. "I don't know," Marcus admitted finally. "I was angry about everything. And he just represented everything I felt I couldn't be." The court hearing was scheduled for the following month, giving Marcus time to consider his options and his future. His solicitor, a public defender named James Morrison, was honest about the likely consequences of Marcus's actions. A member of the armed forces in front of dozens of witnesses, with video evidence of the entire incident, Morrison explained, "The prosecution has an extremely strong case, and you're looking at possible jail time." Marcus's parents, who had been disappointed by his behavior for years, struggled to understand how their son had reached such a low point. His father, Robert Williams, was a hard-working construction supervisor who had tried to instill discipline and respect in his son, only to watch Marcus reject every positive influence in his life. "Son," Robert said during a difficult conversation, "I've watched you throw away every opportunity you've been given. This might be your last chance to turn things around." The community service officer assigned to Marcus's case was Elena Rodriguez, a former social worker who specialized in helping young offenders understand the impact of their actions and develop better coping strategies. During their initial meeting, she asked Marcus to describe what he thought he had accomplished by striking the guard. "I wanted to prove that he wasn't as tough as he looked," Marcus said, repeating the explanation he had given to the police. "I wanted to show everyone that his discipline was fake, that he was just pretending to be strong." But saying the words aloud made Marcus realize how foolish his reasoning had been, especially in light of William's actual response. Elena had worked with hundreds of young men like Marcus. She recognized the signs of someone whose understanding of strength and respect had been shaped by violence and insecurity. "Tell me what happened after you hit him," she said gently. "Did you prove what you wanted to prove?" Marcus was quiet for several minutes before answering. "No," he said finally. "Didn't fight back. He didn't get angry. He just went back to doing his job like nothing happened. It made me look like an idiot, and it made him look even stronger than before. I don't understand how that works." Elena explained to Marcus that real strength often involves self-control rather than aggression, discipline rather than violence, and the ability to maintain one's composure under pressure rather than lashing out at others. "The guard you attacked demonstrated more courage by not fighting back than you showed by hitting him," she said. "He had to overcome his natural instincts and his training to respond with violence, and he chose instead to maintain his professionalism." concept was difficult for Marcus to grasp initially, as it contradicted everything he had learned about power dynamics during his troubled adolescence. But as Alina continued to work with him over several sessions, Marcus began to understand that William's response had indeed been the stronger choice, requiring more courage and self-discipline than any physical retaliation could have demonstrated. Marcus's friends from the neighborhood had largely abandoned him after the incident became public, unwilling to associate with someone who had become internationally known for attacking a soldier who couldn't fight back. Their rejection stung, but it also freed Marcus from the peer pressure that had reinforced his aggressive behavior for years. Alone with his thoughts and facing serious legal consequences, Marcus found himself replaying the incident repeatedly. In his mind, each time he remembered William's composed response to being slapped, Marcus felt a mixture of shame and grudging admiration that he struggled to understand. The guard had possessed something that Marcus lacked, but desperately wanted: the strength to remain calm under pressure and the self-respect that came from knowing he was doing the right thing. 3 weeks after the incident, Marcus made a decision that surprised everyone who knew him. He asked Alina Rodriguez to help him arrange a meeting with William Hayes, if the guard would agree to it. Marcus wanted to apologize personally and try to understand how someone could possess the kind of inner strength that William had demonstrated. The request was unusual, but Alina recognized it as a potentially important step in Marcus's journey toward understanding himself and changing his behavior. The meeting between Marcus and William took place 3 months after the incident, in a small conference room at the community service office. William had agreed to meet with Marcus after consulting with his commanding officers and considering the potential benefits for both of them. The guard was curious about what had driven Marcus to attack him, and whether the young man had learned anything from the consequences of his actions. Marcus arrived at the meeting early, nervously rehearsing what he wanted to say to the man he had assaulted in front of dozens of witnesses. He had spent weeks preparing for this conversation, working with Alina Rodriguez to understand his own motivations and to find words that could adequately express his remorse and his growing understanding of what had really happened that day. When William entered the room, Marcus was struck again by the guard's bearing and composure. Even in civilian clothes, William carried himself with the same quiet confidence and dignity that had been so evident during his moment of supreme discipline. Marcus stood awkwardly, unsure of the appropriate protocol for addressing someone he had wronged so publicly and dramatically. "Mr. Williams," William said politely, extending his hand for a handshake. "Thank you for requesting this meeting. I've been curious about your perspective on what happened." His tone was neither hostile nor overly friendly, but rather professionally courteous, which made Marcus feel even more aware of his own lack of composure during their previous encounter. Marcus shook William's hand, noting the firm grip and steady eye contact that spoke of genuine self-confidence rather than the aggressive posturing that Marcus had used to mask his own insecurities for years. "I wanted to apologize," Marcus began, his voice less steady than he had hoped. "What I did was wrong, and I've been trying to understand why I did it and how to make sure I never do anything like that again." William listened as Marcus explained his background, his struggles with anger and violence, and his growing realization that his attack on the guard had revealed his own weakness rather than William's. Marcus spoke about the viral videos, the online comments, and the way public reaction had forced him to confront the reality of his behavior and its impact on others. "I always thought strength meant being willing to fight, being feared, making others back down," Marcus said honestly. "But when I hit you and you just went back to doing your job like nothing happened, it made me realize that I don't understand what real strength is. You were stronger by not fighting back than I was by attacking you." William appreciated Marcus's honesty and his obvious effort to understand the situation more deeply. "Marcus," he said, using the young man's first name for the first time, "what you did that day was wrong, but I can see that you've learned something important from it. Real strength isn't about dominating others or proving how tough you are. It's about controlling yourself, especially when you're angry or scared or frustrated." The conversation continued for over an hour, with William sharing his own background and explaining how military training had taught him that discipline and self-control were more valuable than aggression or violence. He told Marcus about growing up in a rough neighborhood similar to Marcus's own, and how joining the army had given him structure, purpose, and a different understanding of what it meant to be strong. Marcus was amazed to learn that William's background wasn't as different from his own as he had assumed. The guard had also grown up with limited opportunities, had also struggled with anger and frustration, and had also made mistakes that he regretted. The difference was that William had found a path that channeled his energy into positive discipline, rather than destructive behavior. "The military taught me that real warriors don't look for fights," William explained. "They prepare themselves so thoroughly that they rarely need to fight, and when they do, they fight for something more important than their own ego. Standing at that post, maintaining discipline, even when someone attacks you, that's not about being weak or passive. That's about being strong enough to do what's right regardless of what others do to you." Marcus left the meeting with a fundamentally different understanding of strength, discipline, and self-respect. William's willingness to meet with him, to share his own story, and to treat Marcus with dignity despite the assault had demonstrated the same kind of character that had kept the guard composed during their original encounter. Inspired by William's example and Elena's continued guidance, Marcus began making changes in his life that surprised everyone who knew him. He enrolled in a GED program to complete his education, began attending anger management counseling, and started volunteering at a local community center that worked with at-risk youth. The process was difficult and sometimes frustrating, but Marcus was motivated by his growing understanding of what real strength looked like. 6 months after their meeting, Marcus sent William a letter updating him on his progress and thanking him again for his example and his forgiveness. William responded with encouragement and an invitation to visit him at the palace during a changing of the guard ceremony, where Marcus could see the discipline and professionalism of the guards from a new perspective. Marcus's court case resulted in a suspended sentence, community service, and mandatory counseling, consequences that he accepted gratefully as opportunities to continue his transformation, rather than punishments to be endured. His relationship with Sarah had ended, but he was working to rebuild connections with his family and to establish new friendships based on mutual respect rather than shared aggression. 2 years after the incident, Marcus was working as a youth counselor himself, sharing his story with young men who faced similar struggles with anger and violence. He often spoke about the day he slapped a royal guard and learned that real strength comes from self-control rather than aggression, from discipline rather than violence, and from the courage to change rather than the stubbornness to stay the same. "I thought I was tough," Marcus would tell the young men he counseled, "but I was actually scared and weak. I hit someone who couldn't hit me back because I knew I was safe from retaliation." The guard showed real courage by maintaining his composure and his dignity when every instinct probably told him to fight back. William continued his service with the Royal Guards for 3 more years before accepting a promotion and transfer to a training command, where he helped prepare new soldiers for both combat and ceremonial duties. He often used his encounter with Marcus as an example of how discipline and professionalism could have positive impacts that extended far beyond the immediate situation. The video of William's disciplined response to Marcus's assault became part of military training programs around the world, used to illustrate the power of maintaining composure under pressure and the strength that comes from self-control. William never sought recognition for his actions that day, viewing them simply as the professional response that his training and character demanded. Marcus and William maintained occasional contact over the years, with Marcus updating the former guard on his progress and William offering encouragement and perspective when Marcus faced challenges in his new life. Their relationship had evolved from victim and attacker to mentor and student, demonstrating how even the most negative encounters can become opportunities for growth and understanding. The slap that Marcus had intended as a demonstration of his own toughness had instead become a moment that revealed William's exceptional character and ultimately transformed Marcus's understanding of what it meant to be strong. One moment of violence had led to years of positive change, proving that sometimes our worst moments can become the foundation for our best transformations. Marcus often reflected on how different his life might have been if William had responded with violence that day, if the guard had broken his composure and given Marcus the fight he thought he wanted. Instead, William's discipline had forced Marcus to confront his own behavior and begin a journey of self-improvement that continued to shape his life years later. The incident that had begun with anger, violence, and a complete misunderstanding of strength had evolved into a story of redemption, growth, and the power of responding to hatred with dignity. Marcus had learned that true strength wasn't about being feared, but about being respected, and that respect came not from what you could do to others, but from who you chose to be, regardless of how others treated you.